So I think we are recording now. Has it asked you for your consent?
I have given my consent and we are rolling.
Well, all right then. So as we were just saying, I have absolutely no experience in doing this sort of thing, so I'm going to try to keep the production values as low as possible.
Love
Um,
it.
okay. You are Rainn Wilson. I think most of the people watching this will know that. Famed from film and television and stage. He had a stage career too.
Hmm.
Um, both dramatic and comic. My favorite of your dramatic performances actually is in a little independent film called Drescher. Uh,
Hesher. Hesher.
Hesher, did I say Drescher?
Yeah.
Fran Drescher
Yeah.
must have come to
Fran
mind. Yeah,
Drescher, Hesher. It's easy to get them
Hesher.
confused. Yeah.
Right, right, Hesher. But yes, it's funny thing is I very much like the film, but the title is completely forgettable apparently. No, but I mean
Yeah,
that's my
that was the.
favorite dramatic. But of course the comic performance that is probably going to be most associated with you in your obituary is Dwight Schrute on The Office. And I just want to tell you that as a native Marylander,
Hmm.
your depiction of central Pennsylvania in the character of Dwight Schrute absolutely accurate. I mean that was cinema verite as far as I'm concerned. I mean you captured the essence of Pennsylvania from my
That's
Maryland.
fantastic. Someone once said there was a famous quote about Pennsylvania, and they said it's Philadelphia on one side, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in the middle.
Yeah, I think that was James Carville. I saw,
Oh, that's right. It was.
yeah,
Yeah,
James
yeah, yeah.
Carville,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
And it's true. Although I don't. Okay, I've played. We used to love going up to Pennsylvania Dutch country when I was a kid, so to buy apple fritters. So I have some
Mm,
happy memories of Pennsylvania.
delicious.
So, um, as this is just a conversation, I principally wanted to talk to you about your faith. Ultimately,
Hmm. Hmm.
the Baha'i faith. You're the only practitioner, the only member of the faith I know who was a cradle uh, member of the faith. I know I have about five friends who've converted, in their late 20s or their 30s, but you're the
Hmm.
only yeah, who actually has a lifetime of experience in the faith. So, but before
Lifetime
we,
membership
but and that gets you like a 10% discount on salvation, right? I mean,
and Denny's.
and,
Yeah. It's like
well,
an AARP card.
yeah, yeah. I'm not sure that's as good a deal as they might have tried to make it sound. But anyway, but before we get to that, I was just, you sent me your autobiography well, quite some time ago. Here, I should do the advertising thing.
Here we go.
Wherever fine books are sold, and this book as well.
The
And
Bassoon King. Hmm.
yeah, Basuka, and a lovely inscription from you that even has a little heart on it. See,
Oh.
I don't know if you remember that, but you know, I might have teared up a bit at that point.
Oh, that's sweet. Well,
But
I've
what?
really enjoyed your books. I haven't read them all, but
Neither have I.
um, I have Roland and Moonlight right here on my queue, and really enjoyed the God book and so many of your writings, and I love the way that you think about religion. It's really inspiring, and um, it's Catholic in the original sense of the word, and encompassing, and just enjoy you have a great mind, and I'm a fan of big brains, so happy to speak with you.
Well, now I'm too touched to continue. Maybe we should just end there. That's such a beautiful note.
There we go, and scene.
But actually, the first thing I've got to talk to you about, because of course it turns out we're almost the same age. I was born in '65 and you in '66.
Yep. Hmm.
Um, Now, I had older siblings, so as is often the case when you're the youngest in the family, you sort of inherit their cultural consciousness. So I tend to think of myself as a creature of the '60s, but really it's the '70s that first, that's when the light first opens. And it it amazed me how evocative some of your memories of those days are.
Yeah.
The miserable food the processed food that our parents of a different generation didn't seem to understand was actually 70% toxins. You know,
It's true. I was telling my son about this the other day. Like, he has no idea how good he has it food wise. Like,
oh,
first of all, on my phone I have a Grubhub app, and I can, in 45 minutes, I can have Thai food, Brazilian food, hummus, um, Middle Eastern sushi, just delivered to our doorstep. And like, I didn't taste sushi until I was how old? I was 21,
yeah.
So this is like the late 80s is the first time I had
Yeah,
it. Like,
that's probably true
hu-
of me too. It's my
and
favorite
I
food.
and I
And
think hummus was, this really new weird thing. Hummus, you got to try this dip from the Middle East. It was this foreign crazy. I mean, everything was like, it was spaghetti, tacos, meatloaf, iceberg lettuce salads, burgers, and that was it. We didn't. It was American food in
yeah,
an American time. We didn't have the incredible luxury now of you know any culture that you can possibly think of is just minutes from your door.
yeah, no, I think that no, my son who's 23 grew up on sushi. It's his favorite food.
Hmm.
He cannot imagine a universe where you couldn't even say you get bad sushi if you were really desperate in a gas station. It's just But the funny thing is, I actually have realize that all right, there are privations of the time, and it like every period uh, was a miserable historical period in many ways. And some things are much better now. Some cultural, social things are better now. But I have this odd nostalgia for that time. I find myself, the older I get, the more the '70s calls out to me. I find myself
Hmm.
watching films from the '70s, which there were a lot of good films in the '70s, but there were a lot of brutally cheap, you know, let's film it in 14 days sort of things.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and actually reading your book just took me back a bit to those days in a way that was oddly charming. I mean, I know
There
that you
was
and sorry, what?
No, there's so much great about the 70s. I mean, it was the golden age of American cinema, and even the really bad films, the Roger Corman films and the schlocky horror B films, like, there's something really beautiful about them at the same time.
Yeah, and the great films of the time. I mean, I love also. I mean, I think there are different golden periods in the cinema. I mean, the '40s, obviously, the great era of the studio films, but in the '70s, or actually from like '60s, from maybe like Bonnie and Clyde onward, you think of how many just genuinely great films
Mm,
were made that couldn't have been made in the Code days,
yeah.
for one thing, but just couldn't have been. The quality of writing and acting was different, and the Godfather films are maybe top of the heap, but Chinatown or The Hospital or all sorts of. But yeah, I agree with you. Is actually the second tier and even the low tier quite often exhibited virtues of written scripts now that you have a hard time finding in the cinema. I always wonder what's like. I mean, do you, as an actor, do you ever just find yourself looking for a script that just has something to bite into? I mean, you've been fairly fortunate because let's admit it, you're a character actor who's extremely physically beautiful. So there'll always be a demand for you. But
Feast your
I,
eyes, Notre Dame.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
the great world.
Um, yeah, so yeah, I'm always looking for interesting scripts and stories. They're hard to find. They're hard to write. I've written some myself. Some have been good and some not so good. And it's a hard business, filmmaking. You have to make it three times. You make it on the page, then you shoot it, and then you make it in post production. So, in some senses, you have three chances to get it right, but in others, you have to make three separate kind of creative visions. And
There's three chances to get it wrong too.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Well, anyway, I mean, yeah, the 70s. I think it may be that you know, on my deathbed I'll find myself craving a taco from Jack in the Box or something, and that I've
The
totally,
hard shell crispy
yeah,
tacos with
right.
the
Do you remember?
ground beef in the
Oh yeah,
bottom. Yeah.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Although it was better than Taco Bell, so I'll just point out, you know, it was, you know, it was practically health food by those standards. So.
And indeed.
And the same in popular culture. You watched Kung Fu, didn't you, when you were a kid like me? I mean,
In my new book that I'm working on right now, called Soul Boom,
right.
Why We Need a Spiritual Revolution. I have a whole chapter on how our spiritual mission is very much tied to two great 70s television shows, Kung Fu and Star Trek. So, Kung
Now,
Fu,
Star Trek ended in 1969, so
hey,
it's a
hey,
70s
hey,
show
hey,
because in syndication on
yes.
UHF and kids, there was this thing called UHF television in our youth, which was different from VHF. On UHS, well, UHF television where I grew up, that's where you saw Star Trek. But yeah,
Yep.
okay, good. Kung Fu and Star
But
Trek.
no one saw it in the 60s. That's the
Right.
point. Everyone saw it in the 70s. Um, and it only had, a couple million viewers in the 60s. But the because Kung Fu is the personal spiritual journey, right? So it's Kwai Chang Caine. He's on a quest. He has this spiritual knowledge that keeps him grounded and centered and compassionate, from the Buddhist tradition. But he's in the Old West and he's meeting up with all of these like venomous villains and cretins and bullies and greedy folk and deceiving liars in the Old West. And he brings his incredible grace and perceptiveness and his good,
And the
Buddhist
occasional right
karma.
cross.
Yep. And then when he needs to, and two or three times per episode, he's gonna kick some butt. Twice an episode.
Two fights per episode. That was the formula.
That was, yeah, yeah. And uh, he would kick some ass when he needed to. But that's the personal journey, and then Star Trek is kind of the cultural spiritual journey, and it's not spiritual. Obviously, it's a materialist, physicalist, science-based show where scientism reigns triumphant, and humanity has, through the miracle of science, solved all of our problems around race, and everyone is fed and there's equal justice everywhere. So now humanity can turn to the stars. But there is something really beautiful and downright kind of utopian about that idea that, and I was always fascinated as a kid, like, wait, there's no racism on Earth. There's no one goes
No
hungry.
hunger, yeah, no.
Um, so
War is
we
the
can
thing.
we can put all of our impetus into exploring space and getting to know alien races and building coalitions in space. Like, that's amazing. Why can't us humans be focusing on that right now? I mean, it sounds great. Sign me up. Can't we just work more on that and a little bit less on what's currently going on in the political world? So those two shows in this chapter, but many of the shows in the 70s, like, really inspired me as an actor. All the great sitcoms and comedies and MASH and Bob Newhart and so many great comedies of the time. But those two specifically had a kind of a spiritual component.
Well, no, the funny thing is, well, I mean, with Kung Fu, I mean, I have to admit, I would not have gone into religious studies probably. In fact, my entire life, professionally speaking, was shaped by having, as I considered, my personal masters, Master Han and Master Bo.
Mm,
I really feel that Key Luke, for instance, formed me as a young man, and I owe
nice.
him everything. But the thing you mentioned about Star Trek, it's true. That's another thing about growing up in the '70s is we were of an age. We're part of the post-war. There was still that post-war optimism that had created the United Nations, and we believed that the constant social progress was something almost written into the fabric of things. I mean, for all the tragedy of the time, from Vietnam War, from the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the other murders of the time, we still had the sense that we put, the Second World War has been a kind of barricade, or barzakh, as they say in Arabic, there was no that the future actually could be this sort of radiant, idealist, ever more pluralist, ever more. And I think we really believe that at some tacit level, when you were of that age, we sort of absorbed it in our schooling, but also, as you're right, in the popular media and television, the Star Trek vision. Curiously enough, I think just reflected a certain really kind of buoyant spiritual optimism that was part of being young or being alive at that time, despite the tragic realities around us. And I see less of that now. I deal with undergraduate. I'm not teaching right now. My association with the university is collaborative, not but right now I haven't had any undergraduates for a while, but there is a darker view of the future that, I mean, they labor under, and some of it's quite justified. Obviously, we have a firmer sense of how grave the environmental crisis is, but also the political events of our time. I mean, these right-wing nationalisms and racialisms suddenly returning from the sewers, that we thought they'd been banished to. And maybe that's part of my nostalgia for the '70s. I don't know if the same with you, but is there was a kind of hopefulness amid all the grittiness,
Well, I write about this a lot in the Bassoon King, and I also write about it in my new book, because I remember those. I was quite young, but I remember those times very well, and there were a couple of forces going on at the same time. And in my book, in my chapter, I was just writing about the blue marble photograph that was taken
But
and how revolutionary that was. So it was the first picture taken of Earth sitting in outer space by an astronaut. There had been ones taken from satellites and stuff before, but it was first like from a camera. And it was in 1972. It was in the last Apollo mission, last moon landing. And this perfect photograph of the Earth came, and NASA reproduced it. And all of a sudden, you could buy it in every bookstore, and it was hanging in every library and classroom all around the globe. And that you would see this perfect vision of planet Earth. And there was a kind of a sense of like, oh, now we're going to have world peace, because now we can see, look, we're sharing a planet.
yeah,
We're not Chinese and Russians and Americans and Vietnamese and, and Salvadorans, involved in struggles. We're all human beings sharing this resource, this very fragile, very beautiful planet floating in space. We're all alone here. Let's work on this together. And they're from that, the most famous photograph ever taken. There was all kinds of discussions about world peace and the environment, and there was a hopeful optimism. Some would call it naivete, but beauty contestants used to talk about world peace. What do you wish for? World peace. Now we make fun of them for it, but
no, I don't make fun of them. I think it was one of the sweetest realities that would be the first thing that would spring to people's mind when
yeah.
their lips. No, that
And
that go
and I wanted to say too that what I write about in both these books is there was a spiritual search on, there was a spiritual thirst of the time where people felt like there might be a spiritual solution to the world's issues. Maybe it's not just purely political and economic. Maybe, the Beatles were with the Maharishi and Cat Stevens became a Muslim, and, you know, uh,
Well, but it was pervasive. I mean, everyone. I mean, it was well, the lyrics of Grateful Dead songs. How many of them were biblical, mixtures of biblical and Upanishadic imagery, or they
Bob
didn't.
Dylan became Jewish and
Bob
then
Dylan.
born again. And
Well,
uh,
and now he's both, kind of both. That's Bob Dylan's like that interesting North American phenomenon of a guy who's, in that the sort of interstice of the Jewish Christian consciousness, like Leonard Cohen and and Paul Simon too, actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, but that's the other thing about them is that I try to impress on people is that in the late '60s, in the '60s and '70s, that sense of spiritual of a spiritual hunger, a spiritual quest, something to replace what many saw as the purely materialistic, in the sense of we would normally use that term, materialistic values that the '50s and for some embodied, uh, fairly or unfairly. I mean, that was how we thought of it, and the hope for some sort of transcendence that would have a social, cultural effect, genuinely changing the conscious. And people will talk this way: change human consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, um, and I miss that too. It was again, there was a grittiness and hardness at times to aspects of popular culture and life in general in the early '70s, but there was also that openness to the spiritual without cynicism among the young and
Mm-hmm.
at large. And there would not have been a program like Kung Fu. I mean, if Kung Fu were made today, and I believe there's some sort of knockoff of it now on TV, it would just be about beating the hell out of people. There would
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
spiritual aspects of it would be very sotto voce. You would
Well,
never
and
have an
let's
episode like Chief Dan George, the old.
right. Yeah.
Uh, um, um,
Who I believe was a Baha'i.
well, I think that's right. I think I was told that years
Yes.
ago. And
Yeah.
I loved Chief Dan George, by the way. I mean,
Yeah.
because he became a cinema figure very late in life. It wasn't a long career, but Little Big Man, one of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
films, another great film of the '70s, in which he played old lodge skins, is one of my favorite film performances ever.
Mm-hmm.
The very last scene where he goes up to the hill to die, lies, and the rain falls and he doesn't die. In the book he does, but in the film he doesn't, and he just, sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't. But that episode of Kung Fu, I mean, about,
Mm.
I do not wish to leave this world with a heart full of hate. That actually had when I was, I don't know, 7 or 8, that
Mm.
had a profound effect on me.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
But
And
now,
because later we'll be talking about the Baha'i faith, and what was interesting for me as a young Baha'i lad growing up in those times is there was an open-heartedness of the Baha'i community where we would sing songs and we would literally sing Kumbaya and other in Baha'i, more Baha'i songs, but Christian songs too. Um, and my dad would tell me that he would go down, he would be giving a Baha'i talk or just a talk about spirituality because Baha'is just like to have conversations about spirituality in general, regardless of whatever path you're on. And he would go down into Seattle or Olympia, Washington, wherever we were living. And there'd be these long haired, hippie hipsters in leather jackets smoking or with like the tassels on the brown leather jacket and um, jeans and motorcycle boots and
I
he'd be
make it
like
nostalgic.
and he would say, "Hey, we're going to have a conversation at my house tonight about the Baha'i faith, and we're going to talk about spirituality and the soul and life after death, and you guys interested?" And instead of kicking the shit out of him or spitting on him or punching him, they would say, yeah, sounds good.
Sounds
Love to
cool.
come. And these 19, 20, 23-year-old, whatever, would take time out of their evening to go have a spiritual conversation. They might be smoking a doobie in the driveway either before or afterwards, but
That
it was
that
a
helps.
genuine curiosity.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, yeah. So yeah, I think we have very similar memories, very similar feelings about the time. Apparently, um, maybe again, but I think I cannot remember a period in my life like the period we're living through now, in which hatred has become as fashionable
Mm,
again as it is.
mm,
There are many forces behind it. Some of it is just technological change. I think social media uh, is part of it, but there's something I mean, I do think that there is, in a sense, there are spiritual epochs. I think that we go through things together at a spiritual level that we're not always conscious of, that we can't always explain, that sometimes we see the effects, but we can't isolate the causes and never will be able to. So I'm not going to pretend I know why, but I never in my life until now remember a period like this.
Hmm.
And it's not just in this country, obviously. It's becoming a global phenomenon,
Hmm. Hmm.
and which is actually, I mean, that's sort of like a clumsy introduction to when we finally get around to talking about your new book. I wanted to hold that off to the end. I don't have a copy to hold up. I have all the other books you sent me, but that's not been printed
It's
yet.
not finished yet. That's why you don't have a copy.
Well, that was that. If you had more foresight, you'd have finished it in time for this.
What was I thinking?
Um, but yeah, I, I, I don't know. At times I get very near to despair about the current state of things, and you hope for better. You love that, but where you can feel that sort of that spiritual hunger
Hmm. Hmm.
reviving itself from the ashes. But at the moment, there's such ferocity. There's such a not just a social acceptability, but almost like a hunger for anger, a hunger for hatred abroad, that it feels like all of that memories of the sort you're mentioning almost feel like a dream now. And yet it's not unlike my childhood. People would come, various forms of sort of charismatic enthusiast Christianity, which was kind of like the flower children version of Episcopalianism,
Hmm.
because it was a bit, it was hush. But yeah, kids in the 20s, late teens used to gather at our house to talk about just that, God, about love, about a life of charity and peace and spiritual advancement.
Right. Yeah.
All right, let us talk about the Baha'i faith. I have to admit, I feel like a bit of an ignoramus. I mean, I've known members of the faith for many, many years. Religious studies was my field, and it is. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, geographically speaking, it's only Christianity is more widespread.
Hmm.
Now per capita, obviously that's not true. It's there and very widespread, say in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Asia, in the Americas, South America, Latin America. And I think it's curious, part of the general ignorance we suffer from with regard to the Baha'i faith is its newness. There's a prejudice against, that, well, it's new, it must be a cult, it can't be profound. Now, I can say I don't think I ever suffered from that prejudice, because I had such impressive encounters with the community in the past. But it's not studied in religious studies departments alongside other equally global faiths.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if it's not too boring, I know you do this on a podcast. I know that you do this a lot, but I mean, can we just talk about some of the basics of it for people, some of my readers who may know less about it than say just about any
Sure.
other? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. So, fun facts about the Baha'i Faith. Some basics are that it originated in Persia, now Iran, in the 19th century. Um, the founders of the Baha'i Faith, the Bab, which means the gate, was the forerunner of the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah. And I bring up the gate because it is a very similar relationship to John the Baptist and Jesus, where the Bab had a kind of a religion of his own, and early Baha'is were known as Babis, followers of the gate.
just
But he,
that
yeah,
this you sent me this too. I'm on my second time through actually.
oh, wow.
This is probably an ideal book for understanding the Bab and the Babis, probably, right? Gate of the
Yeah,
Heart.
that's
I didn't mean
it's a
to,
thick one.
I'm not very good at product placement either, as I said, but well, though, it's about 350 pages, but it really is beautiful. And I'm very glad you sent it to me because, to be honest, I feel like my understanding of the sort of pre-Baha'u'llah uh,
Mm,
and how it emerged from the spiritual shaykhi traditions in Persia
right.
has increased 1,000-fold. It's actually very. It's not just a good book; it's a very beautiful book. So,
Well,
but,
I'm glad you feel that way. He's one of the most profound Baha'i scholars, Nader Saidi. He's at UCLA right now. Brilliant writer and scholar, and he's read every single writing by the Bab, which most of them are in archives in the Baha'i Holy Land in Israel. So it's quite an undertaking. Um, but so the Bab continually foretold of one far greater than him that was coming, um, and a follower of the Bab's, Mirza Hussein Ali, announced himself to be the promised one of not only the Bab's revelation, but of all of the world's spiritual revelations. The Prince of Peace, the the promised one of the ages that was going to bring peace to the world, and he was given the title Baha'u'llah, which means the glory of God, and Baha'u'llah announced his mission, his manifestation in 1863 in Baghdad. He spent his entire life imprisoned and being banished throughout the Ottoman Empire.
after coming from a somewhat privileged background, I mean,
Hmm.
that's worth pointing out is that he accepted that life of imprisonment and constraint. Though his own background, he was comfortable. He came from a back. He was not a person who was raised in poverty. Would have had
Hmm.
very high social expectations given his background.
Very, very true, and it's important to note that he was offered, positions in the Shah's, government, and he could have had great wealth and comfort and ease, and he gave all of that up to serve the poor and to be a part of the Bab's faith, and then announce his own revelation, which that we call them the twin manifestations. Baha'is use the word manifestation, so we don't use prophet as much because prophet can mean a lot of different things to different people. Like an Old Testament prophet can be a very, very minor figure who had one prophecy and lived in a cave for 5 years. But it can also be,
Well, some
Daniel
of us
or
aspire to that, but okay. Yeah, I don't.
but he um and he spent his entire life in prison. He wrote hundreds of books and letters, and he wrote letters to all of the kings and rulers of the day, announcing his presence on the earth. And so Baha'is are essentially followers of Baha'u'llah, whose main message was one of peace and unity, just like all of the central spiritual teachers have an essential message. There might be differences in certain appearances, but they deliver that same essential message of unity, of oneness, of peace, of harmony, of compassion. And this was indeed the same message that Baha'u'llah gave. Baha'u'llah and Baha'is believe um, that in something called progressive revelation, and this is important to understand. It's similar to the Muslim idea. It's a little bit different, but it's similar, which is that God educates humanity spiritually by sending down divine teachers every 500 or 1,000 years or so. And these teachers have a very special station. They're not just a very wise dude, and it's not just like a guy who gets uh, channels something from God. They have a station of God made flesh. That the Buddha Abraham, Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, the Baha'u'llah, and countless others that don't that pre-existed recorded history and that will continue to come to humankind as long as we're here on this planet. Um, that they have a very special station and they have a revelation all of their own. So Baha'is believe in the holiness, the sanctity of Jesus Christ. Um, there might be differences in terms of like how we define what the Son of God means. Like, did God have a literal son and he only has this one, etc. Um, but that the title, the Son of God, that station of being a Son of God is a station that is held by these very special spiritual teachers. So
It's a
there's
much
about
more complicated title in Christian tradition too that is often appreciated by Christians. So,
mm, mm, yeah.
um, I didn't mean to interrupt you though.
No, no.
I'm actually, I mean, you mentioned service to the poor.
Hmm.
Um, I think that well, I mean, the virtues of the Baha'i faith, I mean, the moral requisites, in part, are, of course, recognizable from the great faiths, great traditions, but it is also very much a revelation and origin of the modern age, in that it takes into account things that could not have been considered in the past. It's because yes, service to the poor, charity, love of neighbor, justice, honesty, um, working for others in general. But there's also an emphasis on the emancipation and equality of women. That's that is a language that's used by many of the great faiths, but you know, always within a cultural context that somewhat limits the range of how it's interpreted in those faiths historically.
Mm,
Um, in the Baha'i Faith, there's emphasis on education of women, which was in the time of Baha'u'llah. Um, you know, I mean, let's you realize well in Baha'u'llah, even in the advanced West, for instance, a woman who studied at Oxford in his didn't receive a degree. I mean, she could, even if she was allowed to take a course of studies at Oxford, she wouldn't be
mm,
given her degree along with the male students because that it was odd enough that she would want to pursue education. Why would she need a degree when obviously having finished a life of scholarship, she would want to then become a wife and mother. Um, but also, I mean, from a very early period, he's talking about international cooperation on a global scale, uh, unions of people, unions of governments, unions of language. I mean, it is a very much a modern global vision too, of a sort that in previous ages couldn't have been conceived of in that way. I mean, all these faiths are universalizing faiths in that they want to create a universal community. The church, the ummah, the sang, or the community served by the sangha or whatever. But I think what I really find fascinating about reading the teachings of Baha'u'llah is also this really is in the modern world.
mm.
It gives a kind of credibility to the notion of a progressive unfolding of a revelation, however you interpret that in relation to your own faith. Um,
Mm.
and I mean, I didn't mean to. I'm not trying to take. I'm not actually the one who's supposed to be explaining the Baha'i faith here. Uh, but I find that absolutely interesting, and I was just wondering actually if you could just expand on the life. I mean, the moral life and the spiritual life that's
Right.
expected of the faithful.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and you said some really spot on things. You talked about the virtues. So we Baha'is, as so many other, theists, believe that this almighty, all loving, creative presence that we call God occasionally, among other things, wants uh, two things. This presence wants us each to grow spiritually. So it wants David, Bentley, Hart, and Rainn Wilson to be kinder, wiser, more compassionate, more loving, more honest as we progress. Yeah, good luck. Um, so we have an individual prerogative towards spiritual growth. That is in every faith tradition, right? And also that humanity itself, um, Baha'u'llah says all men have been created to usher forth an ever advancing spiritual civilization. So we are part of that Star Trek vision. We're part of the vision of helping humanity grow spiritually. So these virtues that I mentioned, kindness, humility, honesty, compassion, etc., these are all the qualities of God. This is how we have God in us. This is how we are godlike in that we reflect the virtues and the qualities of the divine. And so we want to develop those on an individual level, and we want to help foster those on a global level. And we do that in our communities. We do that through service. We do that through, you know, social justice work. We do it through education, however we can to educate children, youth, adults about these spiritual virtues, bringing people together in harmony and consultation and cooperation to build better communities, more spiritually resilient and bonded communities. This is part of the mission of the Baha'is as laid out by Baha'u'llah. Part of that mission you alluded to is some essential teachings like the equality of women and men, that this is a spiritual foundational lodestone of the Baha'i faith, that women and men are alike in every way. Their souls are equal. One is not subservient to the other. Both need to be educated. Both need to work in harmony like two wings of the same bird. And it's a similar thing about race, class, and other issues of prejudice, that Baha'is are working towards eliminating racial prejudice because we're all one human family. We all have souls. We all have these divine qualities, whether you're from Africa or Asia or the Americas, it doesn't really matter. Whether you're a farmer and a peasant, or whether you're, you know, a, you know, a wealthy, educated person from a high class family in Manhattan, it doesn't matter. We're all equal in the sight of God, and we should work to create social justice, eliminate prejudice, and harmonize the equality of women and men. So, in that sense, it is very modern in that Jesus served the poor and fed the poor and hung out with the lepers and washed the feet of the prostitutes and whatnot. And how does one do that in the modern world? Well, we can still feed the poor, that's fine, but we can also work to build community and to help, again, usher forth this ever advancing spiritual civilization that Baha'u'llah talks about.
Yeah. No, it's and of course what makes that interesting is as that element of a consciousness of the modern and of modern global culture is that um, in the time of Christ, the Roman Empire was just an invincible reality. It was a social order based on property and power and violence, not like ours. Yes, okay. Well, but it was, but also slavery and very rigid hierarchy, social hierarchies. Christ's ministry is entirely to the poor of the Galilee and Judea. Much of, despite rather perfumed translations, much of, in the synoptics at least, the teaching of Christ is really very practical advice to the poor on how to stay out of debtor's prison and how to stay out of being enslaved. You know, much of the Sermon of the Mount, when you go to the original Greek, it's beautiful. It retains its beauty, its spiritual luminosity and incandescence, but it's also exquisitely practical. It's don't don't try to stand up to the violent, oppressive man uh, just by fighting back violently, because you'll lose. Okay, don't let them drag you into debtor's court. Make peace if you, and understand that the evil one, and oponeros really just means an evil man, an oppressor, someone who's trying to put you in debt or take what you have. There was quite a debt crisis at the time in that part of the Eastern Empire. Um, is that the more you appreciate the sheer practicality of his teachings, the absolute concern for the poor, the forgotten, the marginal, and the excluded, the more incandescent the spiritual beauty of it becomes. You know, because
Mm,
it is not a series of bromides. You know,
mm,
put yourself in the right mind. God loves you. It's not just you're all brothers and sisters in a vague way. It really is. You must love and forgive. You must care for one another. When someone asks, he literally says, if someone asks you for money, give it. Don't presume to say, well, I have to needs test you first. You know, I mean, it's that we're
right.
all radically responsible for one another at a very practical level. And much of that, of course, and this is the fate of all religions, not just Christianity, of course, is much of that practical emphasis begins to recede the more the religion becomes part of a pillar of the society
Mm,
it belongs to. I mean, as late as the fourth century, you have figures in Constantinople, the seat of the empire, the seat of the Eastern Empire, but the really powerful seat of Roman imperial culture, denouncing great wealth, denouncing power, say everything you have that you don't need, you're stealing from the poor. There's really radical language. And figures like John Chrysostom preaching in the cathedral, preaching in front of emperors and princes and princesses, and the language would make Bakunin sound like a tepid conservative. But
mm,
the funny thing is that by that point, it's almost as if they're going to church. They're expecting to hear the rhetoric. It's expected. But you can tell that already, given the shape of the society, how many people are actually taking it seriously. It's more and
mm,
more. It's becoming rhetoric rather than an actual demand. And I think one of the things that it was rather refreshing about reading. You sent me the Kitab Khan, the Book of Certitude, is that we haven't gotten to that point. But the Baha'i faith has not gotten to the point where the rhetoric is just rhetoric. I mean, it still has the freshness of a practical demand.
mm,
And
mm,
reading it, it maybe help Christians, help persons of other faiths recall that
mm,
that is, I mean, the spiritual and the practical are nothing in separation from one another. The
mm,
spiritual
mm.
just becomes vacuous platitudes, and the practical becomes ever more timid accommodations with material necessity. Well, we'll do the best we can.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
preaching at you now.
well said. No, not at all. Not at all. It's all part of the same conversation. I sent you a chunk of this new chapter I was working on for your approval, but one of the things I talk about is how inspiring the early church was, kind of before it became fully institutionalized, and that is uh, this idea that for the first time in human history, people bec- built communities based on kind of a shared heart.
Yeah.
Um, for the first time in human history that we know of, it wasn't about tribe and it wasn't about class, it wasn't about gender. You would have freed slaves, you know, Roman conquerors, you'd have merchants, you'd have females, prostitutes,
Peasants. Yeah.
peasants, and they'd all be gathering to remember Jesus, to read the Sermon on the Mount, to pray and sing together, and then they would go serve the poor together. And there's writings in the early history of the Christianity where some of the Romans are like, we just don't understand why
No,
these diverse group of people would get together and like spend their valuable time and their valuable energy and their valuable money feeding and serving the poor that aren't even related to them. They're not in their tribe. They're not of the same race. They're not of the same class. They couldn't understand that in circa 200, 300. And that that was where, for me, the Christian church really sang true with this diverse population loving together, serving together in a new way. It was absolutely revolutionary in the evolution of humanity, and I think ultimately that was Jesus's revelation was inherent in that.
It's a revelation, though, that many of his followers, and I'm not saying this isn't an accusation aimed at others, I aim it at myself too, all of us. It's a revelation that all of us at times find a little too uncomfortable to accept. I mean, you can understand why the temptation has. Well, I mean, look, to give you a good example, I mean, I'm not going to go through it now, but just the sort of like the standard way we pray the Lord's Prayer very much conceals in the original how much of it is concerned with people who are hungry and indebted. We talk about give us this day our daily bread, so that's not bad. But I mean, the word in Greek epiousion really means that's necessary for today's sustenance. Give me enough food to stay alive today.
Hmm.
Forgive us our trespasses. It's really debts, ophilimata, and it really does mean it's talking about a poor people who are under crushing. I mean, basically, and I mean we see it now too. I mean, quite often we have credit practices that basically bind the poorer people to a life of debt. They get a credit card, they need it, right? They can't afford basic necessities, but they miss one payment, the APR shoots through the roof, and the principal then becomes something they can never discharge, and it's perfectly legal. We accept credit practices that are worse than what any of the great faiths permits in regard to the treatment of others. And the Lord's Prayer, really, believe it is very much. It is first and foremost a prayer for the poor, in the sense both praying for them, but a prayer for the poor to utter. And yet, how many people think of it that way when they read the kind of I can say denatured, homogenized version that we all know. So, but I mean, there have always been those also who have remained faithful to that. I mean, you look throughout the history, but it is true, and you are right about the pagan critics. Some of the early pagan critics of Christianity, whose writings we still have, like Celsus and Porphyry and others, is the sheer astonishment that the kind of people that you associate with. This rabble, and one aspect. I'll do my riff, and then I'll let you get back to. The story of Peter breaking down in tears when he hears the cock crow and he realizes that just as Christ had told him he would do, he's betrayed Christ. He's denied knowing him. That's actually a very extraordinary moment in the history of antique letters, because Peter's a peasant, and you really will not find before that moment in anything written for an educated readership a peasant's tears being taken seriously as something tragic, grave, human, worthy of compassion and love and of pity. So yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely. I mean, I think well, it heartens me to hear you say it.
No pun intended.
Yeah, well,
The
my puns would be better.
speaking more of the poor and the importance of service to the poor. Baha'u'llah, of course, one of his central teachings is that work in the spirit of service is worship in the eyes of God. So this is a very modern concept, that your work is considered as worship.
Yeah.
As long as it's in service. If your work isn't to make money, it's not in service and it's not considered worship. So But Baha'u'llah there's a very beautiful book, if people are interested, called The Hidden Words, that has
Right.
just very brief, little almost spiritual koans, um, that distill the essence of Baha'u'llah's revelation and really all of the great spiritual revelations of the past. But in one of those hidden words, Baha'u'llah says, the poor in your midst are my trust. Guard ye my trust. So we're given this command. And I have one right here. I don't have memorized, but one of my very favorite hidden words by Baha'u'llah says, O children of men, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust? That no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how you were created. Since we created you all from one and the same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. Such is my counsel to you, O concourse of light. Heed ye this counsel, that ye may obtain the fruit of holiness from the tree of wondrous glory. Not bad.
Yeah, it's just now I feel like anything I say will sound banal. Now I should just fall silent. Yeah, so it is. It is. Now, let me say this though. I mean, reading your autobiography, I think I told you, for obvious reasons, that the chapter whose little concluding moment, of course, is the one that most striking is the chapter called "The Face of God."
Hmm.
Um, and I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to pry into things that are ineffable or very personal or whatever. But I mean, you weren't always an ideal practicing member of your faith, right? I mean, there is a kind of like a period in your life when you would say that you, not ceasing to be a believer, but nonetheless, your life needed reordering. Let's put it that
Mm-hmm.
way. At least that's the
Mm-hmm.
this description of the time in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I mean, do you think of it that way, that you sort of wandered away and came back to your faith?
Yes, that's exactly how I think of it. I grew up in that, that warm, loving embrace of the Baha'i faith of the 70s. And then uh, I moved to New York City to become an actor at age 20. And there wasn't any specific event, but there were a number of them that happened. I was disillusioned with the Baha'is that I knew. I was rebellious against my parents and all they stood for. I saw their hypocrisy in full glory. I was shacking up with my girlfriend at the time and having, premarital sex, which was not, I won't say not allowed by the Baha'i faith, certainly
Not
not
encouraged,
encouraged
certainly
by the
not
Baha'i faith.
encouraged. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And all of those things together, and I wanted to just go be an actor, and I just didn't want morality and spirituality and God hanging over my head. And so I really hard left the Baha'i faith and anything to do with God and spirituality. And like so many people that have left the fold and then come back, it didn't work out so great. In some ways it did. Like I got a great acting education. I started acting in the theater. I got an agent. And for a nerdy kid from the Seattle suburbs, who had never known an artist before, this was pretty big. I was living in Manhattan and, essentially making a living as an actor. That's a kind of a big deal. But I grew increasingly more unhappy and I couldn't figure out why. Like, I was working as an actor, I was living in New York City, I was living the life I had beyond my wildest dreams. I didn't have any money, but it was uh, just a dream come true. And then I got increasingly more unhappy. I had more and more mental health struggles, anxiety, depression, addiction issues, and it was it wasn't all based on this one event, the Face of God event, but I um I got high on Christmas morning with my roommate. We were living in an abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn, and I think something was in the weed because I started having a really bad trip, and I was sweating, and my muscles were like contracting, and it was Christmas morning, so it was very strange. And my roommate read me Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters by J.D. Salinger to kind of bring me down. I don't know what that happened to be on the shelf. And
For again people of our age, it's perfectly appropriate. I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, there's a beautiful mysticism in Salinger's
yeah.
work too. And and I had a vision of the face of God. I really, truly was like, saw this one. I can't really even describe it. I mean, it just sounds lame if I describe it, but I just saw this incredible horizon. It was really, wasn't like a color or a thing or anything. It was just like this sense of this vast horizon with all these kind of Rothko colors. And I knew, I was like, this is God that I'm seeing. And I swore to God I wasn't going to do drugs again, and I haven't. Um, I abused a lot of alcohol after that point, but uh,
It's a matter of steps, you know.
you got to take this one step at a time. And it was a pretty profound experience, and that was one of the things that got me kind of started on my quest to go like, why am I so unhappy? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense. And that was part of my spiritual journey that ultimately led me back to the Baha'i faith after many, many years later.
I
And by the
mean,
way, it should be said, even coming back into the Baha'i faith, I still struggle and have made tons of mistakes, moral and otherwise. This is not like I'm some arrived, ideal Baha'i by any means. It's all a journey. It's all a path up the mountain.
yeah. Well, there are very few of us who are actually natural saints. I mean, if there were, I doubt revelation would be necessary. But I found that, it's funny things. I found the chapter, well, for one thing, I mean, in a sense, that chapter in your book spends a great deal of time describing the New York experience up to that point,
Mm.
and then suddenly is a kind of grand finale, and I also have had at least one experience that I also can't explain. I can't describe. It was both visual and non-visual, if you know what I mean. I mean, I was seeing it, but if you handed me a pad and paper, I couldn't draw what I saw. I had no pharmacological, nor physical problems dealing with, so I wasn't in a state of desperation, feeling that I might. I mean, I get the feeling you thought you might be having a fatal heart attack because you talk about the pain in your left arm and your chest and your muscles. But I was in a state of despair,
Mm.
and I was visiting Iosoros, this is called the Holy Mountain, Mount Athos in Greece, and it was early in the morning, just after dawn. It was one of the monasteries where, for some reason, I never figured out why, because my modern Greek was kind of spotty at that time. I was fine with Greek that no one actually spoke. I mean, ancient Greek, but this. But for some reason in the morning you had to go outside and wait while they went through their morning prayers, and then they'd open the gates again, and you could come back in, and we had to stay the night in the monastery. And so it was in this sort of I don't know how you describe it, just a sort of covered area with some seats looking out over the Aegean, and in a state of spiritual despair. And I also had an encounter. So I mean, I understand both. How can I put it? The difficulty of explaining it and the impossibility of forgetting it, at once, and how it can change your life, but it doesn't come as a set of instructions. I mean, it sure as hell didn't turn me into a saint. But it did actually make me realize that that I, that the spiritual dimension reality is reality.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so anyway, that chapter struck me, but it was still some years you really felt before you were fully again in the faith, or you know.
Yeah, I went through a period of search, and during that time I read the Bible and read the Quran and read the Bhagavad Gita and the Dhammapadas of the Buddha and some of the Vedas and Upanishads. Um, I really wanted to explore spirituality as a whole and try and decide if I believed in God and what that felt like and what that looked like. I was very alienated from that concept, and there wasn't any kind of aha revelation, but I started tiptoeing back toward the Baha'i Faith and started reading some of the kind of seminal texts of the Baha'i Faith that I had never really read as a teenager growing up in the Baha'i Faith, and I got a lot out of it, and uh, for me, realized that this was the faith that kind of made the most sense to me, and also opened my heart the most and kind of brought the most meaning into my life. So slowly, very, very slowly, by the time like 1999 rolled around, I was back in the fold, so to speak. And right after that, moved to Los Angeles.
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, I think it's a faith. Even if one hasn't grown up in it, it's a faith that speaks to the heart very
Hmm.
clearly. I mean, there's, um, I mean, I could imagine being Baha'i if I weren't bespoke. Or if that were my or baseball or the Beatles, something beginning with a B. Um,
Baha'i Baseball Beatles.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like Bears beats Battlestar
Right, see,
Galactica.
as a
Baha'i
Christian,
Baseball Beatles.
right? As a Christian, I'm at the C. If C, so if I can go back to B, but if I start going forward in the alphabet, I mean that just opens up too many doors.
That's
I mean,
nuts.
first of all, you know where you'll end up is Zoroastrianism, so.
Maybe we'd all be better off.
But yeah, no, so I can, I mean, but also, of course, it was, you have that dual. I can see the dual. It speaks to the heart. It's also home in a sense. I mean, you recognize the home cooking in a sense of
Hmm.
As I say, all my other Baha'i friends are converts late in life. So, and sometimes that can be annoying, because as converts to anything can be just a little too enthusiastic at moments when so you haven't had my coffee yet, but
That's
but
great.
so a couple other things here. You mentioned the afterlife. This is when people, some of the readers who wanted to talk about the Baha'i Faith ask, and one of the questions they all ask is, are there specific, clear, or at least reasonably general teachings about what comes beyond this life, how
Hmm.
how our lives are assessed in the light of God, what how we move on or don't move on.
Hmm.
Um, what is the Baha'i understanding of the life beyond this life?
Um, Great question. Chapter in my new book. I'm excited to dig into that. It's not specifically Baha'i, but I love this idea. In the Baha'i faith, there's uh, hundreds of pages about this topic. So it is very well explored and documented in the writings of Baha'u'llah and of his eldest son, Abdul Baha, who was the center of the faith, of the Baha'i faith, for decades after his passing. And that is that those spiritual virtues that I mentioned before, loving kindness, compassion, honesty, etc., as we're developing those, one of the reasons we're developing those is because those are the ones, that's what we take with us when we go. We don't take our bodies, obviously, we don't take our belongings. We take with us the spiritual qualities that we've developed over the course of our lives. And uh, everyone does. There's not, There is a concept of hell in the Baha'i faith, but it's not a place of damnation of that's there for punishment. Hell is simply distance from the divine, distance from God.
Well,
So,
that is actually very commonly found in the spiritual teachings of well, it's ancient Christianity, but is,
mm, mm,
not to think of hell as a place to which God sends you, but as a condition of your soul in
mm, mm.
relation to the light and love of God. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
And during those some of those dark times I was describing earlier, I mean, I found myself in a kind of hell. I felt like I was in a hell. I was in a distance from God, from truth and beauty and love. Um, so every human takes with them their divine qualities. If you haven't developed many of those divine qualities, you're not going to have as many. Well, one of the central analogies that the Baha'is use is the baby in the womb. So the baby in the womb has no idea why it's developing fingers and toes and eyes and ears, right? And a tongue. It has no idea. It doesn't need any of that while it's in the womb. But we see when we come out into this physical world, we need our tongue and our eyes and our ears and our fingers and our toes, or we're going to be at a great disadvantage. And the same thing works in this central analogy about the next life. So every human goes to another plane of existence. We go, our souls, our eternal souls, make that journey, and we take with us our spiritual fingers and toes and eyes and ears and tongue with us. Um, and if we don't, we're at a disadvantage, but we're not damned for all eternity. We have an opportunity to continue to kind of grow those spiritual virtues as we progress ever closer to God.
Do
But
you? I'm
go
sorry.
ahead,
I'm
please.
sorry. I thought that was a closer to God. Period.
Oh,
Dramatic stuff. Scene as you.
it was an ellipsis, but close
Okay.
enough.
All right. All right. Well, I can work with that. I was just wondering. I mean, I know you've read some of my things. I don't remember if any things you've read have discussed Gregory of Nyssa, my favorite of the church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa.
I think I've read some wonderful quotes of his, but nothing is coming to mind.
Well, no, it's very interesting. For one thing, I mean, he was one of the great Universalist fathers. I mean, all the greatest fathers of the church were. They didn't believe in the
Hmm.
eternal damnation, and but he's the one who sort of escaped the censure of later generations somehow, and and he was the most explicit about it. I mean, in one of his works, the Great Oration, the Catechetical Oration, he just clearly even the devil will be saved in the end. So it was to his benefit that Christ came into the realm of the dead. But he also, I mean, his spirit. He was also one of the great writers on the spiritual life and the way in which the life of the soul is one of almost like a mirror that turns towards the light of God,
Hmm.
and the light of the love and beauty and virtue of God become the mirror becomes ever clearer, and we more and more reflect that radiance. Now, of course, and again, this is something that as Christian history has worn on, different sects and factions have forgotten. But I mean, the dominant teaching of Christianity was in the early centuries the doctrine of theosis, of deification, that we're actually made divine by Christ being made human. Right?
Hmm.
And for Gregory, this is an eternal journey. It's an epectasis. It's a stretching out. And so forth. When he's speaking of the spiritual life, it's hard to tell at times if he's talking about life in this world or the life to come, because the interval, the moment of death is sort of passed over. For him, it's just this entire spiritual journey from this moment into the infinity of God, into the beauty, love, mercy, charity of God, the glory of God that just goes on forever. So much so that he neglects to remember death almost, because the life that he's concerned with is the eternal life that's also already present in this
Hmm.
life.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, And anyway, that was what came to my mind. I will send you a volume of Gregory of Nyssa.
Oh,
Actually,
wonderful.
you
Could you get
sent me.
Gregory to sign it, please?
I will. Yeah, yeah.
Since he forgot about death, he's probably
Yeah, I know.
kicking around
Yeah,
there.
he's still. Yeah, it's just. I just have to get my people to get in touch with his people. You know,
Sure, gets
but
complicated.
but,
It's funny, the mirror analogy is one that's used a great deal in the Baha'i Faith, the
yeah,
idea that we're burnishing our mirrors to shine the divine light ever brighter. Um, but also important is that you have to aim your mirror at the light. You have to aim
yeah.
your mirror at the sun. If your mirror is just in the closet or it's pointed at the shadows, you're not going to reflect it. So you have to
Again, a
turn the sun and yeah.
very eminently Gregory of Nyssa point. I mean, yeah, it's turn towards the sun of the good, sun of
Mm,
holiness.
mm.
Um, and the other question I get that I was asked to ask when I told some friends that I was told them I'd be talking about the Baha'i Faith. I didn't actually mention you because I didn't want to drive them away, you know. So,
Oh,
but yeah, no, actually, uh, they want to know about, is there a life of, is it devotional life? I mean, because of course, if you're Christian, you go to church on Sundays and on the feast days, and you pray. You know that if the Sabbath, if you're Jewish, is on the Saturday, and you observe the Sabbath in certain day. But actually, the thing, many of us have a very vague sense of is what goes on in those houses of worship, or what or in the household as part of the life of faith, not just personal faith, but the practice of the faith as a faith of devotion.
yeah. Well, are you talking about before or after the goat? Is it is it before the sacrifice or because it's a little bit different depending on the moon cycle?
I see. Okay. Yeah. I didn't actually want to get into the sanguinary. So, do you raise the goat as a member of the family before you have to? Okay.
It starts to get a little bit weird. I
Before,
won't go there, but people can
no, no, all
Google
right.
that.
Okay.
Um,
I have to admit, your deadpan there was just good enough. I mean, I can see why you make the big bucks. Your deadpan there was good enough.
yeah, I got you just a little bit. You're
Yeah,
like, did I miss
it's like,
something about the goat
the goat.
sacrifice?
The goat
Um,
is it, well, it could be a reference to some saying, yeah. That was a moment in the Revelation, God has sent unto us a goat.
um, so that's a great question. So I'll just be really specific with the nitty gritty. As Baha'is, we are asked to do a certain measure of devotional activities every day. We are asked to read, even if it's just one sentence or part of a sentence, some of the holy writings in the morning and some in the evening. And that could be one sentence. Um, we are asked to say a prayer called the daily obligatory prayer between noon and sundown every single day. It's a very short prayer, it's 3 sentences long. It says, I bear witness, O my God, that thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. I testify at this moment to my powerlessness and to thy might, to my poverty and to thy wealth, that there is none other God but thee, the help in peril, the self subsisting. See, I said mine for the day. There you go. So that's the daily obligatory prayer. So instead of bowing 5 times to Mecca, Baha'is say that one short prayer. There's some other options of prayers, but they say that one short prayer every day. We're also asked to chant or say silently the greatest name of God, which is Allahu Abha, similar to in Islam, where you say Allahu Akbar, God is great. In the Baha'i faith, it's very similar. It's Allahu Abha, God is
It's
glorious.
glorious, splendid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so we have prayer beads with 95 of, so, and we say God is glorious 95 times as part of kind of a meditation. Um, there's some other things that are called on us. It says in one of the hidden words that I read earlier, it says one that bring thyself to account each day ere thou art called to a reckoning. Um, So this idea that you're uh, taking stock at every day, like, how did I do? What can I improve? It's very 12 step, actually. It's very like, um, how did I do today? Am I closer to God? Am I further away? Did I do good things? What do I need to work on? But just to call yourself up to account. And if you made mistakes, to ask for forgiveness. So that's part of one of the things we're asked to do as Baha'is. As a community, Baha'is gather every 19 days for what's called a feast, and that's just I'm in this little town in California, and every 19 days the Baha'is of this community get together. Now we've been getting together on Zooms, but usually we get together in person, and we pray together, we meditate together, we conduct the business of the community together, like who's going to bring what to the next potluck, or should we have a arts activity in the park, or should we be teaching a class, or what have you, or doing a service project. And then we have a social portion, and that's called the Baha'i Feast. That's every 19 days. The Baha'i Faith has its own calendar, 19 months of 19 days each, and then there's a handful of days that are called
Intercalary.
intercalary days, intercalary days, Ayamiha, and that's a festival of gift giving. And but in the Baha'i shrines or temples, which are only approximately one per continent, like there's one in Wilmette, Illinois, those are open for people of all faiths. So the Baha'is gather in their homes, they gather in rented halls. We don't have churches. There's no clergy in the Baha'i faith. Everything is democratically elected, so there isn't any priests or rabbis or mullahs or anything like that.
I won't confess how enviable that sounds, because I've already burned so many bridges, but and no priests.
Yeah.
Uh, well, I mean, Willamette, Illinois isn't actually all that far away, and it is a very beautiful structure. It has a kind of serenity about it inside. Now, why are they all nine-sided? Is there a reason for that? Is that just
So the number 9 and the number 19 have a kind of a mystical significance in the Baha'i faith. I guess like maybe 7 does for Christians. Um, it's reflection of perfect unity. Um, I'm not exactly sure why. Um, I don't know that there's any like magic reason for that, but some people have said there's 9 major faiths, so there's 9 sides. I'm not sure if that really adds up, but um, yeah. So all of the
well, that
houses of
obliges you
worship.
to decide who gets on the list and who doesn't, I guess. So you have to be
Yeah,
careful of that.
yeah.
But it is, I mean, it is a space. I mean, you do have the sense that it's just meant to be a sacred space for everyone. I mean, it's not built for a specific kind of ritual use, obviously, but it is a very beautiful place. And
There in Arabic, it's called a Majraq al Azkar, which means the dawning place of the mention of God. So that's what Baha'is are building is a dawning place for the mention of God. So it's open for anyone. And if you want to visit David, I have a good friend who lives very nearby, and he does tours all the time and gives visitors kind of tours of the Baha'i temple,
I may
and I
actually,
can connect you.
I may actually take you up on that because I have some friends coming in the not too distant future who would love to come along as well. So yeah, I will.
Oh
Oh,
yeah,
I have your phone number, so I was thinking of calling you up like 3 a.m. sometimes just to give you
perfect.
my notes on some of your performances, and we can set it up then.
Anytime. That sounds great. That sounds
Um,
great.
so I don't want to. We're getting near the 90-minute mark, which is what I think I begged from you, what I got from you. So
That's perfect.
I do have to ask you two other things that may seem to some people more trivial, but not to me. One is when you were growing up in the early 70s watching syndicated reruns of great programs, was The Avengers one of them?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, because
Emma
I
Peel. Yeah.
yes, Mrs. Peel I think was the first love of my life, but you didn't mention. I don't. We hadn't mentioned The Avengers when we spoke earlier, so I had to ask. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I like to think that I crossed the threshold from boyhood into manhood with the help of three great women, Mrs. Peel, Jeannie, and Lieutenant Uhura. I think I fell in love with all of them at one time or another, and it wakened
That's
my heart. It
fantastic.
wakened my heart to the notion of adult romance.
That's
Romance.
great.
Okay, I want to be clear about that.
Okay.
Romance. Don't get any. The other,
No lust, no lust at all.
yeah, none. None. Let's just go with that. None. But definitely, yes, they were all. And Mrs. Peel, Diana Rigg passed away last year, and I toasted her memory with a glass of wine because she'd been so important to me all my life. So good.
Excellent.
People who don't remember the Avengers have really lost out on one of the precious elements of being
It's really
of
too
that thing.
bad the movie they made was so
Oh,
atrocious that,
please don't
but
mention.
they couldn't. But I do think it is worthy of a reboot because although the Avengers has been used by Marvel now, but
It
there's
would.
so much wonderful. I just love that
Oh,
early
and
60s British spy
uh,
stuff with the technology, the James Bond and the
I actually love the pre-Emma Peel period, which we didn't get in this country till much later. The Honor Blackman episodes as well. They had a wonderful. The
Mhm.
scripts were wonderful. Very low production values, but beautifully written quite often. And Honor Blackman was wonderful. You see about reviving it. How do you get another Patrick McNee? It just doesn't seem possible. He's a one-off. He's a you know just one of nature's gifts that was given only once. But
Mm.
well, I'm
Hmm.
glad to know that the Avengers were part of your childhood too.
Sure. Hmm.
And the other thing was just, what did you think of Roland's argument for the existence of God from the Beatles? I sent you.
Yeah, it's astonishing for people who don't know. Hold on a second. I
I've
don't have a
seen.
bookmark in it, but I have a nice
That's
signature as
good.
well. Um, Roland's argument for the, you know, many people say, well, isn't the existence of Mozart or Beethoven or Stevie Wonder proof of the existence of God? And Roland's argument is like, no, that's a statistical truth that occasionally there's going to be a musical genius that comes
Right.
along. But the idea that there would be three musical geniuses and Ringo put
Hey,
together.
don't look down on Ringo. I maintain he was the most musical drummer of the 1960s. He was not okay. You don't get the pyrotechnics of Keith Moon or Ginger Baker, but you go listen to Rain and tell me if that syncopated rolling drum beat is not a beautiful. The song is nothing without that and Paul's bass line. As much as I love the
Well, I had a
John,
much greater appreciation of Ringo watching the Get Back documentary and
yeah,
realizing like what a backbone he was to that band, and he was just dialed in all the time, just giving them exactly what they needed so they could write their great songs. He never
he,
he just
he,
showed up. He was rock solid. I
it,
appreciated that.
but it wasn't just a backbeat. I mean, the accompaniment is very. It's a very musical accompaniment. He was a very imaginative, if not, again, he wasn't Keith Moon,
Yeah,
but that could,
yeah.
that could be that. But
He could get a great job on a cruise ship as a drummer
all right,
in a
hey,
house
hey,
band.
hey, hey. I love
So,
Ringo.
but the
I
idea that
Mhm.
these three geniuses would appear at the same time
The
in
same
a
place.
in a crappy little town like Liverpool in the early '60s,
Now I've got to make sure
uh,
no one from Liverpool sees this, but go.
um, is is really proof of the existence of God
I
because that
think,
defies all
right.
statistical
Yeah,
expectations.
no, I mean, I think his argument. I mean, I've learned a lot from him over the years, but I thought
Mhm.
he really knocked me back with that because you can talk about the multiverse all you want, but there are just some improbabilities that are so improbable that an infinite number of iterations of the universe shouldn't produce them. And just Paul and John meeting in childhood in Liverpool alone is ridiculous. But
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
George being the guy
Throw
that
George in the mix. Yeah.
turning out to
Yeah.
be the yeah. So yeah, I think pretty much we can put that question to rest, right? I mean, there is a
Well,
God,
I think
providential
I
God.
think look how magical this conversation has been. Two bearded men in their mid late 50s on a two-dimensional screen over the internet, beautiful beards rustling in the wind, having a profound conversation about faith and art and struggle and television. Is this, to me, is proof of the existence of God, the fact that we got to have this conversation. And
In all seriousness, I will say this: when there are moments when you're with other people and the experience of community or sudden spontaneous friendship is there, it always, for me, has the feeling of a spiritual reality. You know, it never to
yep.
me is simply, animal comfort in one another. And I remember there's a W.H. Auden speaking of an experience like that when just for a moment, when suddenly he was just among friends talking, and he had this overwhelming experience. This is what we mean by the kingdom of God. That this is what it means to know that we are spiritual beings. You can, so whether you were being a touch ironic or not, I mean,
No,
but
that's what I believe. I think we see the miracle of God's creation and existence in all kinds of everyday miracles. And it's important that we stay attuned to those, because it gives our lives meaning and it gives our lives richness, and it gives us fuel.
Well, that seems like a good place to stop. I think. I mean, I
Oh,
think also, and it's good to see you. You're looking well. I hope you're getting work. You know,
I'm
you
getting some interesting work. Yeah, I'm getting,
know.
and I hope you are too. What's your next book? What are you working on?
Well, I'm never only working on one book. I'm working on. I'm way behind. I'm finishing a book on philosophy of mind for Yale, but also a collection of short stories and a sequel to a children's book I wrote with my son. We're writing the sequel. So those are the three things. I'm really looking forward to your book too. So again, I want a free copy. So, well,
Done.
thanks. And I know it's hot out there right now, so stay hydrated.
It's cooled down a little bit, and I'm very much looking for your natural real beard Santa this Christmas season, and I can't wait to sit on your lap.
You've been there before. Sure, maybe not.
I thought you had a maiden aunt.
I do. I didn't mean that. You see, your mind shouldn't go there. I just meant that I. Well, now I have to wonder whether to edit it. Anyway, I'm going to stop the recording now. We had a wonderful bit where what you said was beautiful. We could have ended there, and I dragged it out, and it's my
You
fault.
dragged it into the gutter once
I
again.
did, as I always do. So good. So thanks again. I'm going to stop. God bless you.
All right.
Take care.
You too.